Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Mary, for that conversation. I remember that phone call very clearly. It may have changed your life, but it changed my life too, and I think our ability to go on and work together and to work on these issues around cities has been one of the great joys of my life and certainly my intellectual life. I've been asked to say a few words at the outset before the mayor's panel comes up to set a little bit of context, and I'll do that. And my friend Jane Hilderman, who's going to moderate the panel, will comment on some of the historical issues that frame our present context, essentially about how we're trying to deal with modern problems using antique governance tools. And Madeline, Redfern, and Don Iveson will share their real-world experience with us in running their cities. As Mary said, I've been working on urban issues for some decades, worked with a lot of mayors and councillors across Canada. And I must say that I have a great deal of sympathy for our urban leaders because it often seems like they're fighting the good fight with one hand tied behind their back. In our governance arrangements in Canada, our cities have limited fiscal tools, powers, and governance structures, which make it harder to achieve. And I want to make the observation, too, that I think we have the best group of mayors in Canada now, in my experience. We have a significant cadre of outstanding people. We have two of them here today, leading our cities who combine a high level knowledge of the structural issues facing our cities with a granular understanding of their own city and its particularities. And I think we're lucky to have such a good group of mayors at this transitional time. At conferences like this, there's a lot of imagining about our urban future, and that's a very good thing. It's important to be able to imagine the cities and the future of our cities, and to understand the role of technology and other things that are going to carry our cities forward, and to imagine how we can expand the cast of characters that are actually putting their shoulders to the municipal wheel. Some of that imagining is, as I say, about how technology can be put to our collective use, how data can leverage our quality of life without compromising our privacy and security, and about how human services can be designed from the needs of the individual rather than the needs of the state. But imagining on its own, without a realistic connection to action and to implementation, can be a very frustrating exercise. There's a vast landscape of abandoned ideas and visionary schemes that have foundered on the hard rocks of reality. And I would say, to be fair, there's a lot of failed practices and lame solutions that persist because of a lack of imagination. So we need to imagine and to connect it to reality. So what is the reality that we should think about when we are thinking about our cities? Well, I can think of three questions that we can pose to test any idea or plan. The first question is, how do we pay for it? When our cities are barred from exercising two of the best and most productive taxes, income tax and sales tax, and are left with largely property-related revenues in property tax and development charges, how to pay for things becomes a big problem. Particularly those big-ticket items like social housing and transit, for which the cities lack fiscal capacity. For those, they have to go to another level of government with greater fiscal capacity, the province or the federal government. And they may have different ideas, different budget priorities, different political realities, and different legislative timelines. And the result, as we've seen in Canada, has been that any funding that does flow is sporadic and episodic. The second question to ask is, how does something work across an urban region? Urban regions comprise many municipalities, In Toronto, we have about 30 municipalities, more depending on how big you define as the Toronto region. Vancouver has 21. So how do transit or water or other municipal services work across those municipal boundaries? If somebody robs a bank in Toronto, can they escape across a municipal boundary in Devon? Well, obviously not, but only because somebody's worked out how policing or fire service or water deals with intra-regional boundaries. But take a complex thing like a municipal sales tax. How would that work? Would, say, Richmond Hill decide to be an outlier in not applying a municipal sales tax in order to become the shopping mecca for the region? It's a choice that they might choose to make, or another municipality. So these are very complicated issues to try and work out. And the third question is, how do solutions work between levels of government in Canada, between municipalities, regional governments, the provinces, and the federal government? This is actually terrain that we know quite well in Canada, and there's quite a literature, particularly around the federal government and the provinces and territories. But we need to be thinking about how municipalities fit into this discussion in a much more practical way than we've been doing. I think grounding our thinking about our urban nation, in grounding this in the realities of the day is important. And these realities, I should say, are not immutable, but we have to be aware of them as we create solutions. Often the innovation we seek involves building regional and intergovernmental cultures of trust and cooperation, things that may not constitute a glorious public display. In our work over the years at Maytree and our other organizations, we've embraced what we call relentless incrementalism, which recognizes that change often occurs slowly by small, achievable steps, but that we must pursue those changes in an unrelenting manner. I think mayors understand this better than most people, certainly better than most politicians. And so I'm looking forward to what the panel has to say on these and other issues. So let me introduce my friend and colleague Jane Hilderman, who will introduce Madeline and Don. Jane is the CEO of Samara, which has become our leading voice in Canada on the state of Canada's democracy. Jane herself has become a go-to person on issues related to how our institutions of government work and how our politicians are able to perform their democratic duties. I'm pleased to introduce Jane Hilderman.
You gotta love a conference that is so bold to put a panel about the Constitution right after lunch on a Friday. And it's raining, so that works in my favor. It's very hard for you to leave the room and go out for a beautiful sunny walk today. No, it's gonna be great. I think there's nothing more interesting than talking about power, and that's what we're really here to do today. And we have two wonderful guests joining us, one from Edmonton and one from all the way from Iqaluit. Mayor Don Iveson was elected in 2013 as Edmonton's 35th mayor. He is focused on the priorities of growing an opportunity economy, building a more family-friendly city, accelerating Edmonton's leadership on energy and climate, and planning for 1 million people, all while strengthening the integrity and performance of City Hall. And joining him is also Mayor Madeline Redfern from Iqaluit. She is currently the mayor of the city of Iqaluit for her second term. Madeline has a strong commitment to her community and strives to be accessible, responsive, and accountable. She has over 30 years of experience working in business governance on issues related to economic development, housing, education, employment, training, justice, community services, childcare, and healthcare. Please welcome to the stage Madeline and Dawn. I'll just add one last thing. As you know, and please have a seat. We have two mayors up here, so we don't have the other levels of government represented. I certainly can't speak for them, but at times I may try to play the devil's advocate just a little bit. So if I'm argumentative, it's not because it's my own point of view that cities shouldn't have more power. I'm just trying to make sure we have a fun and interesting panel discussion. And for anyone who's Googling right now, what does our Constitution say about cities? I'll give you the quick Coles Notes version. As Alan said, it's a 19th century document. We still have a lot of our Constitution rooted in our 1867 British North America Act. And in Section 92, we have a very short phrase that assigns provinces the powers to make laws in relation to municipal institutions. That's really it. There's not a lot more detail than that, and that follows right after by giving provinces powers to oversee shops, saloons, and taverns. So municipalities weren't that on the scene in 1867, and indeed, Canada's population was about 87% rural, and now that's completely the opposite today. So, we're going to get started with some problem definition. Is it working? Oh. Hello? Hello? Change that. No, we're back. Hello? All right. Hello? Have a working one back.
We'll just keep the sound guy guessing.
Sorry about that. So Alan did a pretty good job of doing some of the diagnostic work for this panel, but I wanted to hear from both of you about your personal experience, about what it means to live under our Constitution as is today. And Mayor Iveson, I know you wrote a column this summer in the Globe and Mail that described the relationship between cities and provinces as, I think you used the word lopsided. And I was wondering what you meant in practice by that, and what that means for the city that you lead.
Well, I don't think Ontarians need a refresher in that after the summer. So the history is important. This notion that when the country was founded, it was 80% rural and 20% urban. And if you think about where that urban population was, it was largely in a couple of big cities, Toronto, Montreal, maybe Halifax as an economic center in the Maritimes. And because those were either capital cities or sort of economic hubs of their provinces and regions, it was sort of assumed that they would get looked after. Even though the Constitution didn't necessarily provide for it, there was probably some understanding that we could read in to the history of the time that, of course, Toronto was going to get looked after. Of course, Montreal was going to get looked after. Of course, Halifax was going to get looked after. But we didn't write that down anywhere. It was just convention and the politic and the power dynamic and the economic heft, right? And so nothing has changed there. In fact, that dynamic is even more important and pressing for our country than ever. But not only is the actual constitutional framework lopsided, but I sometimes describe what it's like when the mayors get together as, welcome to the kids' table. Constitutionally speaking, we are at the children's table. And yet, increasingly, we are the grown-up voices in the public discourse on the issues that really do matter, not just today in this news cycle, but that matter for our communities and for our kids and our grandkids. And the level of discourse that the mayors, and I'm privileged to work with Canada's big city mayors, which on a good day, I work for about 932,000 people in Edmonton. On a really good day, I get to speak as chair of the big city mayors for more than half the country's population, 2/3 of its economy, and the most abundant portion of this country's future and prosperity. Not just for the benefit of people who live in those 22 cities, but for every single Canadian. Our ability to project Arctic sovereignty and support infrastructure in Madeline's community is driven partly by resource prosperity in the north, made possible by investment and innovation and logistical support from cities like Edmonton, but also because of the wealth created through innovation and creativity in our largest cities, close to our universities, close to our head offices. So Canada is a laggard internationally when it comes to putting our cities at the forefront of driving our prosperity. And even though we're at the kids' table and that which we control is fairly limited, and we do a lot with 8 or 10 cents of your tax dollar with what is in our jurisdiction, but we increasingly, as with mayors all around the world, seek to influence on issues of consequence to our community that, if unresolved, have a real, not just cost driver, but real existential implications for us, from climate change to immigration to economic inclusion. We have a role to play in all of them, not as controllers, but as influencers, and we're increasingly finding our voice. And so I do this work, just to wrap up, because I really do believe that cities are the places we've been congregating for 5,000 years as a species, because we bring together people, resources, and creativity in multiplicity to solve complex challenges and improve quality of life for our kids and our grandkids. That's the relay race. That's what cities are there to do, and for the benefit of all Canadians if we get it right. And so I'm excited to be here for this conversation, and look forward to hearing from Madeline, and who I have great respect for. She's a fantastic mayor, very different context, and yet as mayors we have way more in common despite the differences between our communities. And the solidarity among mayors will be a force to be reckoned with in this country.
Thanks, Don. And on that note, Mayor Redfern, can you add just a little bit of context about what might make the experience with Iqaluit different vis-a-vis its relationship to other levels of government, or is it the same story?
It's similar, but there are differences. So just to give people a sense of context, what's important is that the Constitution and the way that we frame power and, with 338 members of Parliament, the vast majority is based around population. So as Don explained, is that the vast majority of Canadians live in the urban centers, 90%, about 100 kilometers from the US border. And so Nunavut, which is 1/5 of Canada's landmass, has 1 MP. And yes, we have a tiny population, but if you actually imagine Canada, only being where 90% of Canadians lived, and you cut the rest out, that's where your food is grown. That's where those resources come from, the timber, the mining. So it's that 10%, I'm trying to get my numbers right. We're really important. So there is a healthy dynamic that I think, exists between our municipalities, because we recognize, like Iqaluit, as I've had to say sometimes to the mayor of Ottawa, when we're having a challenge or issue with, one of our residents is stranded or there's some sort of issue, and I call up Jim and I go, I just like to remind you that Iqaluit pumps millions of dollars. Even though we're only 8,000 people, we pump millions of dollars into your city. We boomerang back about $2 billion from Nunavut into the rest of Canada. So, when I, went to Alberta recently, the Alberta economy was, not doing that well, and it was just saying, look, there's masses of opportunity to do business with us. And they literally were mind-boggled, because we have, this robust economy, but it's reliant on each other. So it's, as Don said, even though we get this tiny, tiny little bit of municipal, funds from property taxes, and we have to beg, our provincial or territorial governments or our federal governments, for funding. We have to say, we need funding for water infrastructure. We need funding for roads. This is where 60% of the infrastructure is in our municipalities. So whether it's Edmonton or Vancouver or Toronto or Iqaluit, we desperately need to ensure that the municipal infrastructure is adequate to support all the growth and development that is happening in our respective regions.
So this is great. You're sort of making the case for why cities matter in the sense of the economic value that they bring as engines. But let's talk about the flip side around the spending, the tax question. As I think many in this room will know, cities generally have 3 tools right now to raise funds, property tax being the big one, but also user fees and transfers from other governments, the begging part that you just mentioned, Madeline. And this Toronto manages to put together a $13 billion budget on that. I'm sure your budget, Don, is large too. So what tools would you want to have if you could ask for them? And tell me why they're not forthcoming.
Well, I think it would be worth looking at a much healthier transfer automatically to the municipalities of the tax funds. One of the funds that the municipalities currently get that we appreciate the most is what's called the gas tax fund, and it allows us to determine what our infrastructure priorities are and to fund those. But it's really, really inadequate. But it's the most flexible. But ideally, I think we really do need to be looking at where those tax dollars are going and the process in which we can, build the business cases. For the most part, we have very few, what I would say, are infrastructure strategies. So around housing or telecommunications, transportation, not on just a city-by-city basis, but on a regional basis and on a national basis. Where does it make sense strategically, to put our tax dollars in that infrastructure, rather than what happens right now is that, the biggest cities with the biggest, staff, are able to put forward the business cases. They're 4-year, often sort of terms that we're elected for, so you can get vanity projects rather than sort of, the priority infrastructure projects that are needed. I think we need to be much smarter, I think more strategic, and ensure that we're really investing in infrastructure or services or, development of our own people strategically that benefits not only those, in that municipality or region, but, pretty much for the country. There needs to be that.
Okay, so we've heard the suggestion of having more predictable transfers that offer a lot of flexibility in terms of where they get applied, but allowing that long-term thinking to emerge. Don, do you want to add to that?
So I'll talk about transfers again in a minute, but I want to address property tax because I really have a love-hate relationship with it. It has some virtues. It's incredibly stable. And it's pretty hard for people to evade it because we just seize the property if they don't pay, right? So, and it's relatively straightforward to administer, though there's issues with market value assessment. But fundamentally, it's not a bad base for your budget to fund infrastructure that's attached to that property, along with user fees and utilities and getting into some environmental pricing initiatives and so on and so forth. So there's still quite a bit we can do. And Canadian cities have done a lot. Edmonton is an acknowledged leader in our approach to utility pricing, for example, to incent water conservation and so on and so forth. So we can use the tools that we have, but we're hitting the limits of what they're capable of. And one of the reasons why, and this is going to continue to be an issue, particularly in the largest cities where the biggest innovation and growth of the knowledge economy is happening. And I'll give you a tangible example. There's, you may or may not know, there's a huge video game industry in Edmonton. Any of you play Mass Effect or Knights of the Old Republic or Dragon Age? Yeah, okay, all right. You guys are public policy people. You're too busy for video games. You're here interacting with other human beings, and good for you. But if your kids or your friends are playing those video games, some of those are made in Edmonton because it's part of our storytelling heritage, and I give you a whole lecture about why we have a video game industry. The point is, we attracted a company from UK called Improbable, and they're going to put about 100 jobs in downtown Edmonton in this funky old heritage metals warehouse building. And so that's going to be tens of millions of dollars of new salary in Edmonton. And of course, those people will probably buy property or rent, and that'll pay residential property tax. But the tenant improvements in this building might amount to a few $1,000s in extra property tax if we even reassess it to the city of Edmonton. So we work really hard to create conditions for the growth of those knowledge economy jobs. And the city of Edmonton, in terms of non-residential property taxes, will probably wind up with zero. And so if our goal in this country is to drive innovation and create more of those kinds of jobs and attract foreign investment to bring those kinds of jobs to a country that says, you know, we are going to be welcoming of everybody and we want you to be able to exercise freedom in who you love and what you're going to create, and those are all our competitive advantages, and the province and the feds are going to make out great on payroll taxes and sales taxes related to everything those people buy and everything else. And then the city's sitting there going, well, we're the ones doing the heavy lifting on the economic development, and we put in the bike lanes that help them choose where they wanted to bring their employees, and those cost money, and there is zero return on investment. So the incentive model is fundamentally broken. And so the transfers that might help would be without, you know, Denver has 206 different tax tools, not 3. So they collect their own payroll tax, they collect their own sales tax. And I don't want to create a giant bureaucracy at the city of Edmonton to collect a whole bunch of different kinds of taxes. That already exists in Ottawa and at the provincial legislature. What I would like is a durable legislated agreement that at least if someone's going to tinker with it, they got to pass 3 readings of a piece of legislation. So at least we can all see it happening. Is a durable arrangement whereby as the economy grows, some of that money comes to cities to allow us to replenish the model and do the work. That would be a mature fiscal relationship, and you don't have to touch the Constitution to do that. We're negotiating that kind of deal with the government of Alberta in our city charter right now, and so there's lots of room to maneuver within the existing constitutional framework.
Lots of room, but do you have just a quick answer, Don, why, if you've been asking for it, it's not forthcoming immediately? Is it just about power, or is there sometimes a case for a province to say, actually, it's really helpful for us to be involved because of the regional, multi-level sort of implications?
So I think it is happening. I think we saw it with the gas tax, which is a fantastic transfer model. We're seeing it in Quebec, where all the parties in the last election agreed to transfer, I think, a point of their provincial sales tax to cities as essentially a discretionary spending transfer to offset and reduce reliance on property tax. And in Alberta, we're in the sort of end game of our negotiation with the government of Alberta on a revenue sharing tool that will rise with the economy and also fall with the economy, which is a way better situation than historically when the economy goes up, our grant is flat, the economy goes down, our grant gets cut by 20%, the economy comes up, and the government's still in deficit, so our grant stays cut at 20% until the economy goes down again, and our grant gets cut by 20% again. How do I build a city for my kids that's going to compete internationally for talent and investment with that model? So that's why we got to get off that dependency train and onto a partnership train. And I think the provinces that figure this out first are the provinces whose cities are going to succeed better than the rest in the country. Now, if the whole country can figure this out at the same time, and I think the federal government gets this in principle, but can't do it unilaterally, provinces have to come to the table. The feds can do more with the gas tax model, but I think the will is there because conversations like this are happening, and folks like you are helping my colleagues at the Big City Mayor's table and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities make this case.
Okay, so let's imagine a world where there's an openness to giving a lot more power to cities, but I was curious from a democratic kind of accountability lens, and this is maybe one of the arguments sometimes against giving cities more powers, despite you being the closest to citizens and often the issues that they care most about, turnout in elections at the city level is often lower, and we're facing, a reality where local journalism is decreasing dramatically. So there's less oversight of cities maybe than there has been in the past. How would you respond to that sort of question around the paradox of giving cities more power?
Well, first of all, I don't feel like as if there's a lot less accountability or interest in local politics. If anything, it's very dynamic at our level. I mean, the fact is that most citizens, whether it's in your face at the grocery store when you're shopping or on social media, they have real direct access to us. And they tell us, quite clearly and loudly and often what the issues are. And, again, it's pretty basic. People want water. They want it to be safe and delivered consistently. They want the roads, to be safe to drive on. They want their garbage picked up. I mean, all the services that we offer, when it's working well, for the most part, you might hear a lot less complaints, but anything or that requires our services, I mean, and if there's any disruption, we hear immediately. People do want to know exactly what the budgets are and where that money is going and how it's spending and how to prioritize it on which infrastructure, because it is infrastructure that affects them. Playgrounds, you know, recreational service, skating rinks. So I'm not entirely, for my reality, and maybe Dawn's and other mayors, I think most of us would say that we're definitely, that level of engagement is very high.
Okay.
Well, a friend of mine, Mayor Jorge Elorza from Providence, Rhode Island, puts it really well. He says, in America, if you need an aircraft carrier, you call the feds. If you need a driver's license, you call the state. And for pretty much everything else, you go to City Hall in your day-to-day life. And so it's easy to take that for granted because most of the time it works. You know, 82 lights on my dashboard of 100 lights of what we do at the City of Edmonton are green at any given time, so you're not reading about them in the newspaper. The ones you're hearing about are the yellow lights and the red lights, where we are publicly addressing, very transparently, the foibles and opportunities for learning and growth of the City of Edmonton. And that makes it look like that a certain narrative is built around that, and yet the structure behind it is total transparency. I can't have a cabinet meeting behind closed doors. I can go in private to deal with a land issue or a labor issue or a legal advice issue, but everything else we do publicly. And so I don't believe that there are second-tier or second-class democracies. I think as Canadians, all of our democracies matter, but even our language in this, when we talk about, like the premise of the question, which I know you don't accept, is that there are levels of government, and the feds are like the purest form. It's like Plato or something, you know, it's the purest form of government is no. And the province is like this in-between shadow thing on the wall, and like local government's this afterthought. And yet these are the democracies that matter the most. I know you folks all get this too. And one of the most important things we do at City Hall in Edmonton is a program called City Hall School. And so I think it's a failure of education, because my generation, I'm one of the last ages of kids in Alberta who didn't ever talk about local government at any point in our education. We talked all about parliamentary systems and Westminster, and we know all about all of that, and we did model legislatures, and it was cool. But now the kids come to City Hall and they learn about what the city actually does, and they do mock council meetings, and they meet the mayor and they meet city councilors, and they develop a passion for their local democracy. So I think there'll be generational change on this as people buy in and embrace their local democracy and treat it maybe not as the most important, but when we say levels of government, we imply that hierarchy. And I think this is just as important, what we do at our city halls and county halls and town halls, as what happens at any legislature or at parliament. And so I welcome the scrutiny. I want to take on more. I want funded mandates, and I want to partner effectively, because I know we'll be able to deliver better results. We service 60% of the country's infrastructure and deliver services on that infrastructure with 8 to 10 cents of your money. So not even about more money into the system, but give us a few more. You survey Canadians, and on average they think that the feds have half their money, the province has a quarter of their money, and that their local government has a quarter of their money. So Canadians are overestimating by a factor of 2 or 3 how much money Madeline and I are working with. And they still will say, if you ask them, who would you trust the most with your money? And they're still skeptical of government, but who would you trust most with your money? It's your local government, because instinctively they know we're going to get better results in partnership with community and philanthropy and industry, and because we have to be scrappy and everything is done transparently. So I'd say give us more rather than less.
Okay. I know our time on this panel, and sadly, is already running down. It's felt so short, and I know we started a little late, but I was wondering if there were any questions from the floor for this panel. It could take maybe one or two.
I have one. Ooh, that was really loud. I'm
Hello.
so sorry.
Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Robin. Thank you both so much for being here. I'm wondering to reflect back to something that Andrea Reimer said earlier, that we in this room have more power than we might realize. And if we're talking about the Constitution and this balance of power, how would you like to mobilize us? How could we use our power to help you exercise yours?
So how do we get an evergreen accord started?
So I believe that a democracy is about leadership from the people, and I take my instructions from folks. who I serve. And so what we need is not chest-thumping heroic leadership or hero-villain leadership, and we're seeing a little too much of that boil up provincially and federally, and a little bit of that municipally here and there. But we need, and I think the way to keep that honest and keep leaders focused on solutions is to demand it and not reward politics of division, not reward or indulge in populism, but articulate a narrative about where do we want to be in a generation for our kids. That's what I keep going back to. If I have to make a tough decision, I would rather make the right decision for my kids and lose the next election than do the wrong thing and shortchange my kids just for short-term political purposes. And I think if the public can give cover and courage through civil society organized like this to politicians to do the right thing on things like pollution pricing, it's not popular, but it's right. So we need cover from organizations like this on that issue, but also on, I don't want you to leave and say we have to open up the Constitution, because no one wants to have that conversation. And I think that you rewrite the Constitution in 5 or 10 years to reflect the innovation and the experimentation that if you can encourage your provinces to figure out how to put their cities first, and make that case that the provinces that do that and the countries that do that will be the ones that succeed and solve their public health challenges, solve their innovation challenges, solve their fiscal challenges, and solve their environmental challenges by leveraging the capacity of all of their orders of government as partners, rather than indulging in this politics of division and othering, which is not getting us anywhere. I think you can help us raise the level of debate in that respect and ask us to be innovative and collaborative rather than say we have to rewrite a piece of paper. I think the piece of paper follows the culture change and the demonstration of results within the existing constitutional framework, which again has huge room for us to innovate on these transfer tools, on innovative collaborations around things like housing and urban indigenous reconciliation, for example, on what we could do practically around climate mitigation and adaptation. There's tons of room for us to work without having to have a crisis. That said, we would invite the federal government to assemble all of the parties to discuss what we could do as innovatively and collaboratively. And if you join FCM and the mayors in calling for that would, and want to be at that table too, so that civil society is there, it's not just a bunch of heroes trying to fix it, that would be fantastic.
I really like the idea of having the paper follow the culture. That's helpful. I think we have time for one more short question, if you can be to the point. Thank you.
I was just wondering, as a mayor, what's your biggest challenge as a city to attract talent and investment and actually differentiate your city on an international scale?
I missed the last bit.
I'm going to try to paraphrase how to attract talents to cities, especially when competing on the international scale.
And differentiate.
Oh, and differentiate on the international scale, since the cities are competing with each other around the world.
Well, for us, one of the things that we recognize is, as a capital city, we're naturally a hub, a regional center, but we have also many opportunities that I think that we're not taking advantage of and we're squandering. I look at what other Arctic nations are doing, whether it's putting a university in Tromsø or a university in Nuuk, Greenland, and seeing how that can be so transformative, because it's not only educating the people that you need to be good governors, like good elected officials, good managers, but it's also innovation. It's good for business. And so we have many opportunities that just need to be sort of thought of a little bit differently. And another one that I want to speak to briefly is, to add on what Don said, is that we need to also remember that we have an Indigenous population, and there's a tremendous amount of knowledge and innovation and wealth that we can harness there. And yet, at this point in time, we need to stop thinking of it as an Aboriginal problem, because for the most part, any problems that Aboriginal people have been created by government. But yet, with the treaties, which are constitutionally recognized, and with the funds that are available, they are an incredibly, valuable partner that I could see us being unique and way more strategic in our investments and outcomes as a result.
I'm so glad you brought up Indigenous relations, because I think in a Constitution 2.0, that's a really important part of the conversation. I know time ran a little short for us to talk more fully about that issue, but in our closing, I'll give you a chance to maybe provide 2 minutes of closing statements each. And if you want to pick up on that theme, I think it's a really important one, as part of our reconciliation project is reimagining a new governance relationship with our Indigenous peoples, and many of them are urban. In fact, I think over half now, according to the census. So I'll turn over the mic to Don and Madeline for final words.
So the differentiation question is, I know this is going to hurt in Toronto, Connor McDavid. The hockey fans know what I'm talking about, or Wayne Gretzky if you prefer. But no, I mean, Edmonton has defined itself in various different ways over time, but its geography is one of the constants. And one of the neat things about the geography is there are traditional Indigenous trails that converge at a beautiful river crossing point near our legislature that archaeological evidence from various campsites around there date at 7,000 or 8,000 years of continuous human inhabitation, and some evidence that could suggest as much as 13,000 years. So there is a rich Indigenous tradition in Edmonton, and its old Cree name that is still used is Amiskwichi Waskahigan. And so we're rediscovering a respectful and decolonized story of our place, and that is important because Madeline was talking about 9 out of 10 Canadians living next to the U.S. border. Half of everybody else lives in Edmonton. So when we call ourselves the gateway to the north, we are the jumping off point for healthcare and for education and for innovation in the resource economy and for agriculture and food production. And we're the closest big airport to Asia for food export, which Canada is going to be one of 6 net food exporting countries in the next 20 years. And us feeding the world is going to be one of the big sources of prosperity. Value add and innovation and safety and standards around that is going to be one of our differentiators. So whether it's food, or whether it's bio and life sciences, or whether it's artificial intelligence and machine learning, which we can lay a claim to one of the 3 big hubs in Canada on that, there are phenomenal things happening in our economy. Great quality of life, relatively affordable housing compared to the other large Canadian cities. You buy a house for about $400,000, and the best public schools in the country. The best public schools in the country. So that's our talent generation strategy, and our attraction strategy for people with kids is you can come and have some of the best education in the world for your kids. It's not going to cost you an extra $20,000 a head to get that. And the nice thing about it, we have the largest middle class in the country by population, is that you get true economic inclusion and integration that way. Because the wealthiest people still send their kids to public school, with all of the other kids, Indigenous, immigrant, and multi-generation settler Edmontonians. And so I encourage you to come and check it out. It's a fun place. Neat things are happening. And reconciliation is part and parcel of it, because in the West, the largest number of Indigenous Canadians is within 100 kilometers of Edmonton. So Winnipeg proper has a little bit bigger population right in the city, but I could do an hour about reconciliation, but that's becoming part of our story and our identity too. And what I love about it is it doesn't start when settlers showed up, which is too much a part of the Canadian narrative. It starts by acknowledging that there are thousands of years of rich history here. And our new Royal Alberta Museum, which you can come see in downtown Edmonton, also tells that story in a much more respectful way.
This is great.
Okay, all right.
You can talk to him after about moving to Edmonton. Thank you. Madeline, do you have any final comments?
Best public schools in the country.
No, I think what I just want to add is that we don't have to change what's actually written in the Constitution to be way more flexible and way more creative. When the federal government decides to include Indigenous leaders to certain meetings, it hasn't undone the country. When now FCM sends representatives to federal, provincial, territorial infrastructure meeting, we don't disrupt the meeting. If anything, you know, having us in the room and at the table, no longer at the children's table or outside the room because no one bothered to invite us anyway, it means that we're bringing the perspectives of all Canadians that need to be considered. We need municipalities, we need the provincial territorial government actors there, we need the federal, and we need Indigenous people, because at the end of the day, we have each a role to play. And I think if we're all talking together in the same room, the outcomes will be better.
That's a great note to close on, and I want to thank you both because I think you've helped me see too that Constitution 2.0 needn't mean a classic Charlottetown Accord meeting, that we have to negotiate the paperwork first, but start living it first, and we can push the boundaries in what we are living now and be a bit more imaginative, creative, flexible, innovative when it comes to everything from tax to democracy to reconciliation. So thank you, and let's give a round of applause of thanks.